of will the current coronavirus crisis reduce the resistance towards Eurobonds? And we have two excellent speakers to guide us in this debate. Vitor Constancio, who's the former Vice President of the European Central Bank, and who's now also teaching in Portugal, and Maria Canetta, who's the chair of MTS, a trading platform of the Borsa Italiana, and who's also, before that, was the head of the debt agency in Italy. So I think both people are extremely well experienced to help us, to guide us in this debate. I've asked them both, let's say, to initially give an introduction of altogether something about 20-25 minutes, after which I will take questions. So you will not be able to openly, let's say, mention your question, but the questions can be given through the Q&A session, and I will filter this question and then ask them, let's say, to both of the speakers afterwards. So we will start with Vitor with first this question, and I will also ask the same question to Maria, but first to Vitor. Vitor, could you explain us what are Eurobonds?
Well, Eurobonds are mutualized debt, is issuance of bonds, which in possibly different ways have the liability of all member countries behind them, joint and several in some modalities, and other modalities not so explicitly, but with the same practical effect. And that's why having all countries on the basis of their importance in the European GDP will give them AAA status, and of course then very low coupons and yields in the market. These Eurobonds were first talked about back during the sovereign crisis to avoid countries to lose access to markets and continue to be financed. That situation is different now, and they reappeared first in order to prevent that such a situation with the increase in the deficits that are now ongoing, that could lead to countries losing access to markets or paying too much. That's one reason why they reappeared now as a proposal, as an idea. And secondly, because they would be the expression that we are all suffering a common shock. So a common answer is justified, reflecting a degree of solidarity among European countries and putting them on equal footing to finance their needs. So this is also at the same time a test of European cohesion. The Eurobonds have several advantages. I don't know if very briefly you allow me to go through them and I then finish my first answer, let's say. Well, the big advantage, of course, is that they ensure financing, access to the markets, independently of the rating of the countries. And that's important now because countries face the absolute need to increase their deficits in order to take care of their populations and their economies. And they fear, of course, that this question of ratings and access may come up later on. And that's why you see that Italy, Portugal, Spain have presented so far programs to face the crisis which are lower than other European countries in percentage of GDP. They are being cautious. And that's why the response of Eurobonds would be important. It's also important because Eurobonds would be for all countries, whereas, for instance, programs of the ESM would be for weaker countries. That's the rationale and nature of the ESM, which means that the countries that would use those facilities, those programs, would be subject to a stigma, to assign to the markets of their weakness that could then trigger rating downgrades and create the whole problem. And that's why countries are somewhat reluctant to go that route, although later on, of course, it will be available. So it will be cheaper, but also that involves, of course, a transfer between stronger countries that pay less when they go individually to the market than they would pay with Eurobonds. But that transfer then is part of the difficulties of acceptance of this idea in some stronger countries. Of course, there can be other transfers. There are many types of Eurobonds. That depends then on the rules of distribution of the funds that are obtained. So transfers could be higher than just the difference in the interest rates or not, depending on the rules to the distribution of the funds that are collected. Another, and I will finish with that, if the amounts would be significant, another important advantage of Eurobonds would be that they are safe assets that could be used by banks to diversify their portfolios away from domestic debt, which is, as we all know, an important concern in Europe. And also, they would be a big contribution to the idea of a capital markets union and to the internationalization of the euro.
Okay, thank you, Vito. That's very important, certainly these last two elements, let's say the contribution to capital markets union, to a single European capital market, because we have seen over the last days this danger again of the friction in our capital markets as well, and the attraction of the dollar, and of course the issue of having a safe asset. Maria, I turn to you. How do you see this from your perspective, from your previous position and from your current position and sitting in Rome? Maria, good morning. You have to unmute, yes.
Sorry. Yes, I would start from the last consideration of Vitor. So the importance of giving to the market a message that there is a true European safe asset. This could be very important to help the banking union and to relieve the pressure on the domestic banks. Moreover, I wanted to underline that these bonds, Vitor said that could have different schemes or legal forms to be implemented, but in my opinion, the joint and several is the only that for sure will be appreciated by market participants because it is something really European. If you start to fragment the composition to ensure only guarantee that need to be shared per country specific weight in the European institution, this risk to be not useful at all, not so useful, and not to give the right message to the market. This will be not so well received. Apart from statistical problems in terms of accounting, because another element is that such a bond, if joint and several, will be something that is not charging national debts in the statistics, and this, on the contrary, with other models, risk to be unuseful in this sense. Moreover, it is very important the effect that such issuance, common issuance, true common issuance, will have on the domestic markets, because you have already noticed that when there is an announcement that letting tender to market participants that there is a big commitment from a European institution, ECB first, but in the present situation, something more is needed. if there is such a message clearly sent to the market, the spreads are tightening, and concern regarding the effect on single national public accounts will relieve a lot. This is it is extremely important to reduce the volatility in the market, ensuring investors everywhere in the world that there is a true European commitment. In this, and what is different in the proposal of Eurobond now against other similar proposals in the past? It is the fact that the pandemic is spread everywhere in Europe, even in the world, and needs such a situation needs a response as large as possible, as common as possible. And it is true that Italy has been the first country hit by this contagion, and also with some surprise effect. But what we are seeing now in Spain is very similar to what happened only a couple of or 3 weeks ago in Italy, in northern Italy in particular. And we hope for sure that the experience of the Italian case can help other countries to avoid the same uncertainties that characterized at the beginning our response to this problem. But it is not so evident that our experience has been profitable at very early for others. And moreover, there is also an evidence that the numbers appear very dramatic in Italy and apparently less in others, but there are the reading of the data has to be more accurate because the number of tests has been not the same. The way in which statistics are produced are not the same. So it should be very important to have such an instrument. Moreover, this bond has, in my opinion, all the characteristics for a common social bond, following also the principle of United Nations sustainable principle for issuance bond. In the past years, it has been very developed, the green bond market. Now probably it is an occasion to have a European social bond for the purposes that are necessary for facing the effect of this epidemic. This is very important, and probably with an European instrument, some steps that in the preparation of this kind of bond are relatively long could be shortened, because for example, the marketing for make aware the investor what are the purposes of the bond should be very limited and not so long. And it is also important to act very promptly, very quickly. This, and moreover, the question is who would have to issue such a bond. I don't know exactly what is the perfect subject, but for sure the EIB has the knowledge and the experience to monitor the effect of the usage of the proceeds of this possible issuance. It should be probably empowered, both in terms of capital and staff, but the expertise is there. So these are my very preliminary consideration on that.
Okay, Vitor, I mean, thank you, Maria. I wanted to go back to Vitor specifically on issues of designing of the Eurobonds. I mean, basically, this is not an old debate, I mean, a young debate. It's a debate which has been going on for 10 years or even more. We know certainly after the last sovereign crisis, there have been many proposals for forms of Eurobonds. We know this proposal of the blue bond, for example, the red bond, and all these issues. If you could just say a bit, how do you see all these different proposals now in the current debates, or say, and what is the current proposal for you for a Eurobond, and also probably what is the role of the European Central Bank into that?
Well, yes. When I mention other modalities, I was not thinking about different ways rather than joint and several about Eurobonds. I was thinking about the issuance, say, by the ESM or the Commission, that would be in practical terms as strong in terms of rating as individual new issuance of joint and several Eurobonds, but are of course different. And that's also, there are also differences, not in terms of the status of the bonds vis-a-vis the investors that would buy them, but in terms of the use of the money. That's where you have many different possibilities and different proposals, like in the past with the red blue bonds and other proposals, that the differences had to do with the use of the money. But let's see the comparison with, say, the use of the ESM or the Commission. Well, the ESM has capital, and the countries are committed to pay in more capital if necessary, which means that, of course, the bonds issued by the ESM have also triple status, because in practical terms, not being formally joint and several, but in practical terms, they have the commitment of all countries, so they have the AAA status. In a way, they are a sort of Eurobonds because of that commitment. The problem is, of course, that the ESM can only then provide loans to the countries, and loans then that are mostly used by weaker countries that have no other resources when they have lost access to the market or are about to lose that access or are facing very big yields to issue. So they are for weak countries. So they carry a stigma and provide a bad signal to the markets that could help triggering further downgrades and create then further problems to the debt of the countries. And that's why there has been some reluctance in this situation where the needs were not created then by any misbehavior of any country, but it's a natural shock that is common to all countries, that there has been some reluctance in using the ESM. The other possibility then would be the Commission. There is an article in the treaty, Article 122, Item 2, that says that facing a natural disaster or exceptional occurrences for which the countries are not responsible, then the Union can provide assistance to member countries. That would then allow to create a program or a fund managed by the Commission that would be funded by the Commission issuing debt in the market, which in practical terms, again, is as good as a joint and several Eurobond. And that would be used for that purpose. And then, of course, countries would have to pay over the years an additional contribution to the budget to face the service of those bonds. But that, of course, would not be counted up front as debt of the countries. It's part of their commitments to the European budget. And these programs that the Commission could create are of, again, different types. Initially, they could be used to take care of health expenditures and unemployment expenditures in member countries. That's a possibility. And then there is another thing I wanted to mention, which is that Europe will need also a new real fiscal stimulus down the road. Because when the health emergency ends, the recovery will tend to be sluggish initially, not buoyant, for different reasons. In the first place, because there will be more risk aversion on the part of economic agents, as it happened after 2008. Saving rates went up after that crisis, and they would tend also to go up this time. So no buoyant expenditure immediately after the health crisis ends. Second, there will be during this period destruction of productive capacity. There will be many bankruptcies. They are already going on with unemployment. And that, of course, will hamper also the buoyancy of the recovery. And third, there would be damage. There is damage to the world supply chains and to trade that also will impact growth at that point. Also because there will be strategic changes on the part of many firms to localize more production and shrink supply chains. That will impact world trade and growth. So we face then the need to have recovery bonds, a program of strategic investment in Europe, but this time really having real money in significant terms at the center. Not like the Juncker plan that had its limitations because there was not much money put forward by the public sector initially. It was useful, but limited. So we need more this time. And for all these purposes, then the Commission could be used. It would be quick to, start the issuance and would have these potential consequences. Not using then the Commission in this way, then the member states to issue Eurobonds would have to create a new legal framework for them and then give the operational part, the logistics, to some institution, because creating a new one would be too long, to an existing institution to provide the service. I don't think, contrary to what Maria said, that the EIB would be, very suitable for that. She mentioned that the capital would have to be increased, but this modality of Eurobonds would use an infrastructure like the EIB or the ESM has just providing the service of, preparing the issuance, taking care then of putting the bonds in the trading platforms for the secondary market. All of that can be done by some infrastructure that is already used to issue bonds like the ESM. Personally, I think the ESM would be more appropriate to provide that service. It would not be an ESM program. It would be just a service provided by the ESM to the joint and several issuance of then what would be new Eurobonds.
Okay, thank you, Vitor. If I could turn back to Maria, probably to react on some of these statements from Vitor, but also, Maria, if you could say, from your perspective, because you've been in the markets, you're chair of a platform which is trading government debt, how you see the advantages, but also the practical consequences of having a Eurobond. Where will it be cleared and settled? Will it be cleared and settled in many different platforms of Europe, or will we see a centralization? You mentioned also a moment ago already the impact on volatility and on spreads if we were to have a common Eurobond. How do you see this from your perspective? I think these issues are not sufficiently in the debate, the practical aspects of having a single Eurobond.
Yes, I do not believe that this new bond would have a particular features so different from the national one. The system in Europe is already built. Moreover, with the target to security, there is a possibility for different settling house to connect to the directly to target to security, but being this ideally a bond issued by an institution like ESM or another new one, why not to go directly to target to security, the system of the central ECB directly, but no problem, technical problem to settle everywhere in different settling houses in Europe. The connection is fully operational and no problem on that. Regarding the secondary market, I believe that due to the important positive signal, there will be less volatility and less stress to different national issuances. And this simply because the market in such a way will be comfortable with the fact that a problem that is not I don't manage to tell idiosyncratic, sorry, but very, very general, has been addressed at the central level with a unique response. And the difference that can remain in the appreciation of national debt will be really related to the specificity of any market, allowing an ordered functioning of the secondary market. This is very important. Moreover, such a bond could be placed using the service of market makers. It is important to create a system of market making, but this is not difficult. And it should be even easier using transparent trading platforms like, for example, MTS for the interdealer trading, and also other transparent venue like, for example, in the MTS world, Bond Vision, or for retail transaction, even MOT in Italy, and other probably similar transparent trading venue and that are in Europe. I don't see particular problem on that. Probably the choice, the most important choice for the interdealer platform, where the major size of a transaction are working, selecting a platform that can ensure the continuity and solidity in terms of IT infrastructure and the business continuity aspect very strong. This should be my idea on that. And not because I'm chair of MTS. MTS could be an ideal choice for that, but open the question. A transparent and very well organized and respecting a strong relation with the regulator, it could be the ideal seat where to organize the trading of this bond. Asking to the major banks that are playing the role of primary dealers in the European countries to play this kind of role also for the Eurobond.
Okay, thank you. I will take some questions now. We are about half an hour in this webinar. Probably the first question, let's say, which I found a nice question, is what are the disadvantages of a Eurobond? Probably Vitor starts, and then I give it to Maria, but very brief, and then I will take some other questions as well.
Well, the disadvantages are seen mostly from the perspective of countries, strong countries, that can issue right now, for instance, at very negative interest rates. And perhaps the Eurobond would not have the same so low level of interest rates. So they would, as the proceeds of the Eurobond would then be used by all countries according to the distribution rules to be decided, it means that the strong countries would pay more for their part, their contribution to the service of the Eurobonds than they are paying for the national debt that they issue. So that in itself is a transfer that, makes them reluctant, as we have seen, to accept the idea. As I said, the transfers could be even higher depending on the rules of the use of the funds. But for instance, if all countries in the end, in one way or another, participate in the costs of servicing the Eurobonds, the interest and amortizations will have to happen. And so in one way or another, all the countries would have to contribute according to their size, their importance in the European economy to the costs. If they would get from the funds obtained the same sort of percentage of GDP of their costs, there would be no further transfers, just the difference in interest rates. But that depends, as I said, on the distribution. For instance, if the route of the Commission would be used, and if one of the programs that would be launched would be related to health or unemployment, then the percentage and the importance of those expenditures in each country would be different, and the transfers in the end could be, in some cases, even either way. But that's part of an insurance concept behind these Eurobonds. And we have to be aware of these possibilities. So the disadvantages are mostly from the perspective of the stronger countries that have opposed in the past and have showed reluctance now, although perhaps diminishing, to have this, which nevertheless, as we have been talking, would be something that would be a one-off event dedicated to face the crisis and put the countries on the same footing in what regards the financing of the expenditures with this crisis, but not the launching of a permanent scheme of Eurobonds. That is another discussion still to be had in the future, because the robustness of a monetary union would be much more reinforced if there would be a more permanent scheme of at least partial use of mutualized debt and the creation of a big amount of safe assets in Europe, with all the advantages that we already have mentioned. But that's another discussion. Now it's about really putting the countries on the same position regarding how they have to face the crisis, and to have an answer to the fact that the weaker countries are spending less than stronger countries, and in some cases their needs are even bigger than, in terms of their size, than the needs of the stronger countries. And that's the emotional component of this discussion, which has, of course, political consequences. And we see that some degree of resentment is emerging in several weaker countries because they don't see a reflection of some bigger European solidarity at this moment. There were elements of solidarity, we cannot ignore them. The fact that the Stability Pact was, suspended, that state aid rules were suspended, that the ECB, which ultimately its balance sheet depends also on all countries, has indeed responded in a bold way to the crisis. All those are elements of that solidarity, but of course, not enough in such a acute crisis.
Maria, on something on this disadvantage of Eurobond, but also if you could say something about how you see it from your perspective, issues related to conditionality for issuance, which I think will be also a sensitive issue in Italy.
So I believe that in this specific situation, speaking of conditionality is not the right response to the problem. If you refer to a conditionality that is related to general economic choice in the future after the end of this epidemic. If you, on the contrary, intend the conditionality in having an accurate monitoring of the usage of the proceeds, I believe that this is quite obvious in the nature of this kind of initiative. So it is clear that a strict monitoring of the spending of these resources is necessary, and this is in the interest of the countries that are beneficiary of this money collected in such a manner. And this indirectly would also help to strengthen the economy of the beneficial country for that. And this is quite implicit. For the rest, I don't see other inconvenient or disadvantages than those mentioned by Victor. And also let me add, nevertheless, that all the concern to lose something in terms of cost for the interests by the strongest country in Europe should be acceptable in a vision that is very, very short, because in the long end, all of us are knowing how strict are the trades and the commercial and relation and productive relation between, for example, Italy and Germany, or other the commercial relation of all European countries. The integration of the space, European space of trade is almost complete in this sense. There are strict relations. If, for example, the capacity of production of goods in Italy is jeopardized or compromised by the lack of this solidarity, would turn also in a negative consequence in the German economy, for instance. And it is a very myope vision that is looking only to the potential slightly higher interest to pay on that, and neglecting all the rest of the economic consequences.
Maria, I wanted to add some follow-up question. If you speak about conditionality and about procedures, let's say, to decide, don't you think that will become extremely, I mean, from your experience in the past also, that this may become extremely long, difficult stuff to agree on these decisions? Let's say how to, share the money? Knowing how the EU works and knowing what we've seen, for example, again, over the last weeks.
So, in the last weeks, we have noticed also big progresses in Italy. We started to have a difficulty in monitoring and organizing the distribution, for example, of medical tools and so on. But all of us in Italy, we are expecting an improvement in the organization of common good performance in terms of public administration functioning. So moreover, let me know that also at a national institutional level, there are also discussion in how to combine properly local responsibility and the central responsibility when there are such important challenges born in consequence of this kind of problems. And the effort is to overcome this, and I'm aware that also in Germany there has been at the beginning some different manner to face the problem, because certain matters are under exclusive regional, local, in federal, states, federal level. And all of us, same in Spain. So the problem in how properly organize intervention, especially in such situation, such a kind of situation, has been have been risen, and this push in the future the possibility of increasing the efficiency internally in every country, even in Italy. Italy, I do not believe is the worst example in this moment. There have been uncertainties, but you know, such uncertainties were present also in other countries that were seeing what was occurring in Italy, and now probably we can, in certain aspects, not everywhere, be an example, also an example that would help other countries to not do the initial mistakes that can be have done.
I have several other interesting questions. I mean, there is one for Vitor Constancio. I mean, if the Eurobonds are issued and end the dollar's reign, causing hyperinflation and the crisis in the US economy, is the EU prepared for this fallout? Which I found interesting. I'll let you reflect, probably, Vitor.
Sorry, can you repeat? It's about the impact on the US economy?
If the Eurobonds are issued and end the dollar's reign, meaning we have a bigger share or a bigger international role of the euro, and that there is hyperinflation because of what the Fed is doing at the moment, and there is a crisis in the US economy, is the EU prepared for this fallout?
Well, in the first place, the amounts that one can envisage behind the type of programs and responses, for instance, the ones I mentioned, the size of that can be, of course, very significant, some points, percentage points of GDP of the euro area, but that would not be an overwhelming change in the international monetary system. It would be really not so significant. Only a significant permanent program of Eurobonds would be a game changer in that respect of the international monetary system. So the sort of consequences that are behind the question will not arise because of what can be now decided. But that's a different than issue that indeed for the future, we would like, I would like, and many Europeans would also like, that the euro would have a much stronger international role, because that's in the interest of Europe. There are many advantages of a country having an international currency that the United States has the privilege of, having because of the dominant position of the dollar. And by the way, final consideration, what the Fed is doing is indeed very, very bold. It's going beyond what the Fed did in 2008 and 9, but even so, that will not create hyperinflation in the US or anywhere else. If anything, in the next year or so, we may face deflation because of what is happening to oil in particular. And then this will stop. There will be a big recession. So indeed, there are no risks of hyperinflations going forward. These same concerns appeared in 2008 and 9, that hyperinflation was coming. We saw that in many newspapers and magazines in Central Europe. I still remember them very well, and inflation didn't come. On the contrary, we have had during 10 years very low inflation. So those concerns are really not justified.
Okay, question for Maria as well. Are you suggesting that these bonds could be repurchased by the ECB under its QE program? Meaning, can Corona bonds be bought by the ECB?
Why not? So ECB has already clearly stated that they are not privileging sustainable bond. In this manner, they are indirectly told that the green or social bonds are included in their purchase of assets. They have expanded the assets that are eligible for this PPP program, and I don't see why they would have not to buy Eurobond. Moreover, it should be also for the ECB budget, the ECB portfolio to have such a bond in the normal activity of the purchase program. Absolutely, why not?
Well,
moreover, they needed to also to expand the asset class, because even before this crisis, they found some difficulties in, for example, respecting the capital key for certain countries that have not issuing enough to allow them to respect this capital key. There were in some market difficulty of funding a right diversification of this purchase. The Eurobond should be a natural eligible asset for this. I never thought that this bond would have not to buy under the purchase program of the ECB included. Why not?
I agree. The ECB will be very happy if this European safe asset would emerge to really then be part of the quantitative easing and the purchases the ECB is doing, because also it means that the caution with not having too many bonds of a particular country would not exist if there would be an European bond. And so it would be indeed a very important contribution to monetary policy implementation, the fact that there would be an European safe asset.
Yes, let me also add that one of the major concerns in Germany, in my knowledge, is the difficulty for German insurances or pension funds in Germany of having a safe asset with a little bit more remunerative than bonds or similar bonds. And one of the pressure to not continue with the purchase asset activity from the ECB was just because the depression of negative yields is potentially a big problem for the pension industry, especially in Central Nordic countries, and for the budget of some banks and some institutional investors, especially pension and insurance, in Germany or in other core countries where the lack of a safe asset, the combination of this with a very, very low yield as a potential problem and not negligible.
I had another specific question for Vitor in the sense that, I mean, somebody's asking the question, let's say, if you use this article 122.2, how long does it take? And who will take the lead to do this? Meaning, this was also an argument which Klaus Regling mentioned in his interview with the Financial Times a few days ago, where he said, we have an institution. If you do something different, it takes time. It takes at least 18 months or 2 years before you can do this. We have an urgency, so let's use the ESM. And also recall, Vitor, what you said. Look, there is some kind of connotation to the ESM as related to the sovereign crisis. That's maybe a hindrance for some member states to use the ESM.
Yeah, to use ESM programs, of course, not to use ESM as, a facilitator of the issuance of Eurobonds, for instance. But yes, that is true. I also mentioned other reasons why there is some reluctance of weak countries to use the ESM because of the stigma of the bad sign to the markets that transmits. Indeed, but the Commission is there. The Commission has done this before because there is financial assistance to balance of payments of European countries, several European countries, initially in the Baltics and also Romania and so on, got this assistance, and the Commission issued debt in order to fund that financial assistance. So the Commission knows how to do it, can do it, and if there would be a decision by the Council for this article to be used, then it would be very quick. Of course, it could be very quick. There will be no institutional or, say, logistical obstacle to that to be put in place rather quickly, provided the political decisions would be taken about going ahead and about what sort of expenditures, what sort of size would then be that program. It would be in principle also for the 27, of course, but there can be also an arrangement of having only part of the countries doing it, and then of course there would be a sort of fund that would be managed by the Commission for those countries. So the use of the Commission is there as a possibility, indeed, and would be also quick.
Can I ask a question for Maria? Let's say there are some people who are asking, let's say, can we do this without further coordination of fiscal policies?
Yes, it could be a way to increase a coordination of fiscal policy, but this is an open question and probably also a path that has been already prospected in the past, for example, by Piercarlo Padoan. It is part of the proposals that he advanced for specific reasons without imagining in any case such an emergency that we are living now. But this is exactly what was the proposal for Mr. Padoan before. And it is a way, it is quite evident that the European building needed to progress. And then this could be a first step, especially using the Commission, the European Commission issuances for assistance that has mentioned Victor, to move ahead, to progress in a major coordination of public finances. But we have to see, honestly, the Regling statement that it would be necessary between 1 year to 3 years to go ahead in for a Eurobond. This is something that is consequence of the long time that was spent in the sovereign debt crisis in some European countries, in idiosyncratic situation. Now we are not in such a situation. We are in a common problem that is investing everyone. That could be some different size, but not so much in the impact in any nation. And this is a problem whose magnitude is so relevant that can be taken as an opportunity for progressing in a union, a stricter and more solid union in the future, only in terms of major coordination in public finance policy.
Final question for you both. How long will it take before we manage to have such a decision? Because that is a question which is asked by several people. Will we manage to take such a decision in the next European Council? I mean, how optimistic are you that we're moving in this direction?
Well, I see it difficult because this is nevertheless, being more and more discussed in all countries, including the Central European countries, where the press and the media have been, in a way, putting some pressure on their own governments to come up with something that would be an expression of true European solidarity. So the pressure is there at this moment. Well, the Eurogroup will meet on the 7th, but in principle to discuss some adjustments to a potential ESM program. Well, I think that they will come up with something, perhaps almost eliminating all the traditional conditionality used by the ESM, but even so, the stigma and the bad sign for the markets would be there. So I doubt that in practice, countries, at least at this stage, would really use any ESM program, even if there would be almost no conditionality. There is another consideration, which is that any sort of ESM program could be used to trigger OMT by the ECB, meaning more unlimited purchases of particular bonds from a particular member country and not buying all in proportion to the capital key. That would be a possibility. Nevertheless, the OMT, one of the conditions is it can be used if there is in the market a deviation of the yields paid by a country from what would be a fair value of debt bonds. A big, attack on a particular debt of a particular country that we saw during the sovereign debt crisis with very big yields that clearly were not justified by the fundamentals. And that's one of the conditions for which the OMT was created, to really then correct that abnormal deviation. That is not happening now. So that condition for the use of OMT is not now verified. But nevertheless, let me say, to conclude on this point, the ESM is there. We should not totally demonize the ESM. Down the road, if the situations would become worse and countries would have to spend much more, then there may be a situation in that worse future where the ESM would have a useful role to play and should be used at that stage. So let's make this difference and this conditionality on the discussion about the use of the ESM.
Thank you, Vitor. Maria, are you optimistic?
I don't know. I'm skeptical. romantic. I prefer not to be optimistic or pessimistic because really we risk to. I prefer no comment on that. I don't know. I would be to be very optimistic, but we will see. I prefer no comment at all.
Okay, and it's just 12 o'clock. Let's say we said we would have the seminar for about 1 hour. And let me conclude. I mean, I would say I'm personally not too negative. I see, let's say, there are many possibilities, and let's say both speakers gave an interesting perspective. Let's say, Vitor, thank you for your perspective to put it also in the perspective of the sovereign crisis, which you have experienced very closely. Maria, thank you for putting it in the perspective of how you see it from the Italian perspective, but also from the functioning of the markets and what possibilities you see from there. We will have a brief summary of this, which will be posted on the ACME and CEP's website afterwards. So if I can thank all of the participants and also those who have raised questions for their participation, and also above all thank Maria and Vitor for their contributions, and also thank my both colleagues Beatrice and Fanny, who have been managing this system just to make sure, let's say, that you have an interesting presentation. So thank you very much and have a good day, and hope, let's say, we can continue the discussion very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.